All right, good evening, everyone. Good to see so many of you here. My name is Marjolein Lansing, and on behalf of me and my colleagues, Katrien Schultz and Olaya Aro, Katrien is sitting right here, and Olaya is sitting in the back. I've organized this event, and we want to welcome you to our conversation on algorithmic injustice. This is the closing event of our workshop and our research on algorithmic discrimination. Not of the research, because we're still in the midst of it, actually, and that will be future work as well. But at least of a very interesting workshop that gave us a lot of input to work further on. That workshop and also this evening were generously sponsored by, now is the sponsor part, by, the RPA, that's the research project, research priority area of the UvA on humane AI of the University of Amsterdam, but also the NWO project of Professor Dr. Robert van Rooij, which is called A New Approach to Generic Sentences and Implicit Biases, the Institute of Logic, Language and Computation, the ILLC of the University of Amsterdam, and also my very own philosophy department of the UvA. We're very thankful and grateful for their sponsorship. All right, now back to why you're here. Well, maybe you're here because you're worried about the Toeslagenaffaire, the child benefits scandal, and how this went wrong. Maybe you're here because you saw Nerit Pellet's documentary on the use of algorithms in predictive policing and how this can go wrong. Maybe you're here because you worry about how clunky algorithms are transforming into smooth AI systems like ChatGPT that spit out discriminatory code and answers, and how this can go wrong. Several reasons. Algorithms play an increasingly important role in our daily life, but come with serious societal risks. In recent years, we have seen many cases of algorithms that show unfair, biased behavior towards particular groups or individuals. What if they become institutionalized? Now, despite growing concerns about algorithmic injustice in AI research and policy, the remedies against algorithmic discrimination are often narrowly framed as design challenges. But is the solution always a techno fix? What about the structural and the social dimensions of discrimination? And should engineers in the end determine what is fair? So tonight, we will discuss these questions together with researchers from various disciplines. We explore and discuss both the philosophical and technical aspects, as well as the lived experiences of people who suffered from unfair algorithms. We have Sulin Blodgett, who has been working on AI and fairness. We have Aaron Breagley, who has worked on the wrong of stereotypes and still working on that, and will have a book soon. Naomi Appelman on the unfairness of online proctoring, and documentary maker Nerit Pellet, who documented first-hand stories of people who suffered the consequences of unfair police algorithms. I now want to give the floor to our moderator for tonight, Laila Frank, who will introduce our speakers and who will guide us through these thorny issues. Laila, good luck.
Thank you. Well, it's a full house, it's a hot topic, and an all-female panel, so I don't think we can go wrong here. Thank you all for coming. Welcome to the people at home. Welcome to our great panelists. I'm Laila, I'm a journalist. I work on change and I work on America, to go briefly. And in my time in California, I wrote some stuff about tech, and I was writing a story about humane tech. And I was interviewing many people, and when I introduced myself and said I'm going to do a story about humane tech, they basically all made the same joke, saying, well, that's going to be a really short story, isn't it? So let's see if that's the case tonight. We have a lot to unpack, so we made some building blocks. Let's see if we can keep to them. But I first want to take the opportunity to introduce our panel. Again, we did an introduction, didn't we? We're going to do it again. Documentary maker, storyteller Nerit. Naomi, researcher. Also, can I call you an activist? Maybe. Okay, we'll get there. Sulin, we're on first name basis, by the way, if you're wondering. Sulin, you work on bias and neurolinguistic programming. No, that's not right. On thank you. There's so many afkortingen. Thank you. Language is hard. I know. And also, maybe just to get it, we have 5 people and 4 microphones, so we are going to be switching microphones. If you're like, that's messy, it is what it is. It's life. And we have Aaron. Aaron, you're a philosopher, and you work on stereotypes, to go very short. We'll get into all of this. But here's a panel, there's a floor. I also want to know about you and what brought you out here. Any students in the room? Okay, shy, but okay. Designers, tech people, maybe? Yes, okay, you are doubting. Sir, this brings up a question. You're in doubt if you're a designer?
I'm an entrepreneur, so I have many hats.
And what hat are you wearing tonight?
Design is one of my favorites, yes, but I'm also worrying about technology.
So what brought you out here tonight?
Do what?
What brought you out here tonight?
When I was born with a lot of curiosity. So that's the...
You're actually human, congratulations. Good for you. And also, because you actually said you are in tech, is that correct? And what brought you out here?
Yeah, I work on gender bias as well, so yeah,
Okay.
and I'm also part of a minority, so like I'm interested in algorithmic justice, yeah.
So are there any, I don't know, civil servants, people who work for government? Really? Wow, they should be here. Okay, I'm just gonna go around a little bit because it's nice to know who's here and what you're actually interested in. Can I ask you, sir, what brought you out here?
Sure, it's, let's say, general concern. So I work a bit with AI. I've always worked with digital technology. I'm a technology optimist. And obviously, any technology has its downsides. And I think from politics, we have to regulate it.
Okay. We'll get to that. I'm going to go to the back, and then I'm going to go back to the front. No worries. Any students out here? Oh, shy. So what brought you out here? Can I ask you that?
Yeah, it's fine. I had to write an essay about this, and this is a very efficient way, but I'm also very interested.
You could have asked ChatGPT, you know?
This was more honest for me.
Thank you. Okay. All right. And I'm going to ask this, sir, just because you're like on the side. What brought you out here, and what's your profession?
I'm a management consultant for a few big financial corporations, so for the CIO usually. So they are currently in transition to use AI more in their products they offer to the market. So for me, this is, knowledge gathering as well.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you. We will get to the knowledge gathering. All right. So let's start with some real-life experiences about algorithms. And I want to start with you, Naomi, because you're a researcher, but you actually made headlines when you brought a case to the Netherlands Institute for Human Rights about discriminatory software. Can you tell us about the case?
Yeah, where to start? It's been 2 years in the making now, and it's still ongoing. I think it's good to start with that it's not my story to tell per se. I'm very much the second choice, as the case is brought by Robin Pokorny. She is the student that actually had to deal with this software, that had to work with it for more than a year, had to take our exams with the laugh on her face.
If you say the software, can you tell people what
I'll
it is?
get there. So I'm together with Hans de Zwart and also Jill Toe from the Racism and Tech Center. We helped her now for almost more than a year now, 2 years, in bringing this case to the Dutch Human Rights Institute. And the setting is very simple and familiar. It's COVID, it's the lockdowns, universities still wanting to take exams, and phrasing it in a way if we still want to allow students to take their exams, but what they're doing is forcing them to use software that surveys them and is really aimed at ensuring that they do not commit any type of exam fraud. So the basic idea is you're a student during lockdown, in your living room, in your bedroom, wherever, and you have to download some software on your computer that will verify that you are taking that exam and that you're also alone. So it has facial detection software, and that's really the tricky part that we're going to focus on, that is aimed at identifying that there is a face, and more importantly than one face in screen, so that there's not, taking the test together, but you're doing it alone. So it's really aimed at preventing fraud. Well, this software was rolled out globally. And not long after universities started using it, a lot of news items started pouring in about students of color, black students, brown students having massive issues with it. Not being able to enter their exams, face not found, room too dark, or being flagged more as frauds or potential frauds because there was no face detected during taking the exam, which is, of course, very suspicious. Well, Robin, her experiences as a black woman perfectly lined up with all these news items. She had all these issues with the exam software, having a lot of trouble giving her access to her exam, and was worried about all these flags. And in the end, she figured out a way to deal with the system in the same way that also these news reporting, etc., students have been doing globally, namely to take all of her exams in her living room with a lamp, a really bright lamp, right in her face, because that was the only way to to be sure that the software would give her access to her exam in a very stressful moment, of course. Well, so from the beginning, she noticed that she had these issues, and then these news reportings were coming in, and she was trying to flag this with the university, but there was really no way to do that. And at some point, we teamed up and started helping her with it. And for more than a year, we tried to raise this issue with the university itself. We tried to go and say, like, where can we would like to file a complaint about what we believe is racist software. Where can we do that? Basically, no avail. There was no procedure, there was no way to file a complaint because there was no specific person who did anything, so there couldn't possibly be any type of discrimination or racism, right? Well, in the end, we kind of forced them, and specifically due to Robin's persistence and tenacity, we forced them to recognize that this is a complaint and we want you to take it seriously. Well, then, of course, they rejected the complaint, said, like, we looked at it, thank you for informing us, but no worries, there was no racism, there was no discrimination. So, of course, again, due to Robin's persistence, then we decided to go to the Dutch Human Rights Institute and file an official complaint for discrimination based on race. And that was now already more than a year ago, and it's still ongoing, but they have already given an interim verdict, so like a half verdict, which has already been very important and influential because it's the first time in the Dutch context that they used anti-discrimination law to say that these type of software can be discriminatory, and that she gave enough evidence to have a really solid suspicion that yes, something really did go wrong here. And what I think is also very important is that the verdict is very clear about who is responsible. The public institution using this type of software is responsible to ensure that it's not discriminatory. So they can't hide behind some developer or be like, oh, we don't understand how it works. All this complicated software, we only buy it, we don't know.
And we'll get to actors and who's responsible and how that works in the system later on. Thank you for sharing this story at this point. I want to go to Nirit because you also have a story about how algorithms can change lives in a not positive way. You have made a beautiful documentary called Mothers, and it's basically about how the lives of 4, but of course there's more mothers, changed when an algorithm got hold of their boys, basically. And it's an algorithm that's used by the municipality of Amsterdam to predict crime or criminal behavior. And before we get into it, I would like to check out the trailer together of the movie.
De gemeente Amsterdam heeft 250 politiemensen vrijgemaakt die jacht moeten gaan maken op 600 veelal jonge veelplegers in de hoofdstad.
Dadertjes, slachtoffertjes. De politie weet nu precies welke kinderen welke risico's lopen en waar ze wonen.
Voor mijn zoon was de overgang naar de middelbare school heel heftig. Ik zag dat hij er moeite mee had.
Toen hij begon te puberteit, weggelopen, niet naar mij te luisteren.
Ik werd gezien in de buurt als een moeder van een crimineel.
Nee, want ik ben verdachte. Ben ik verdachte?
je doet je best jouw zoontje om goed te doen. Maar als jij op straat, je verliest jouw kinderen.
Zij weten niet dat er ook een andere wereld is. Dit is de wereld voor hun. Gewoon warzone.
Je wordt al heel jong, wordt je toekomst eigenlijk bepaald door hoe de politie met je omgaat.
What's it like for you to watch the trailer? Oh, sorry. Wat zei u? Oh, we have an extra guest. What's it like for you to see the trailer again?
Yeah, it's quite a big flashback because I worked on this movie for so long, and now it's been half a year. I feel like it started walking without me, so it reminds me a lot of that period of IDFA.
I'm trying. We have a little. Oh, it's your earring. Okay, there we go. Oh, too bad.
Too bad.
So it's been a couple of months since you said goodbye. You've sort of done with the movie, but you're not, obviously. Can you tell us about why did you want to make this movie, and why did you want to make a movie about this subject?
Well, I've been researching, let's say, the system side, which was not only about an algorithm, I have to say. It's always so complex to understand, but it's a part of a program that's kind of is using a lot of risk assessments in order to list youth at risk. And some of the ways to put those kids on the list was an algorithm that actually the Dutch police is using. But I've been researching that for a long time. And I have actually, at some points, I actually thought it made sense. It's easy to be inside the city hall or inside systems, and there's a lot of good people working everywhere, and they all say, we want to help. And the situations they encounter are very difficult. But when I met a group of women who were their mothers of kids who are listed on this list, I had this thought that I thought, that people who suffer algorithmic harm, they don't know what happened to them. So, and it was really weird because I knew the system very well, and they just told me about their problems, what their boys did, and they didn't know. And I thought, wow, they really don't know. But everything they told me just fits all the indicators they told me. And I thought, you moved 3 times. That's why you're on the list. That's one of the indicators. And I thought that there was this disconnect between what I knew and what they knew. And that kind of frustrating 2 worlds, which were completely the same, but it was very hard to connect them.
Yeah. And now that you're talking about 2 worlds, we saw the women in the movie, but they're actors, right? Yeah. They're not the real mothers. Why is that? Why did you make that choice?
Well, officially I made the choice because some of these women didn't feel safe at one moment, and I had this very difficult choice if I'm going to do what I always do as a documentary maker and take them out for dinner and talk to them and tell them how great it is for them and how wonderful it will be if they tell their story. But at one moment I thought that it was true. They were actually not very safe to tell that. So I was looking for a way to visualize them so that they can tell the whole story and not negotiate what they're telling and what they're not telling. But also, the difficulty was that the algorithm is in this other world, right? This other reality with the data and all. And I had to find a world where they could meet, the algorithm and the women, because they actually don't really meet. And their alter egos, who are somewhere in the data, in a report, that information meets the decision makers, but themselves, they never met anyone. So I thought that it was necessary to find a fictive world where I could tell the story of the system and the story of the people in the same kind of setting.
Yeah. And you also told me that because it was COVID, there were so many actors who were willing to step up.
COVID did help me because I worked with amazing actresses which were just sitting at home and they had nothing to do. So when I called them with some crazy idea, they could actually spend days with me trying to speak without their own voice. Yeah,
and they're really wonderful, fantastic. Yeah. If you have a chance, go see the movie. Thank you also for sharing that. Sulin, I want to get to the both of you, actually. Do we have a mic? Yeah. because these are real life stories about algorithmic harm or algorithmic injustice. I'm trying to understand how the harm gets into the algorithm and what part of the bias or the, I want to say prejudice, but the stereotype that goes in there has to do with how it's built. I know it's a very broad question, but I think a lot of the questions people have, or a lot of questions I have, are really broad because it's so hard to grasp and it's so big. So what I'm trying to get at is what part of how these algorithms are built should we understand to have the right kind of conversation?
Yeah, that is such a good question. Actually, I know Erin is, because we just had dinner with each other, is brimming with really good examples of all these things. I don't know, would it be helpful to start with some of these other examples of these stereotypes and harms? Because I think sometimes it's like very hard to get a sense of what these things are without more concrete examples. I don't know, do you want to?
Sure.
Sorry to put you on the spot, but like, I just had dinner with you, and I know you just had very good examples.
Yeah, so I think the first thing to say is there are a lot of ways in which algorithms can be biased, and stereotypes and stereotyping are only relevant to some of those ways. But one way in which stereotyping can figure into bias design, I think, relates to the testing algorithm. So, for example, designers can have in mind when they design a product kind of this picture of who their user is, right? Who the stereotypical user of the product is. And that can be pretty narrow. Another way is that, and I think this is most relevant to this case, testing is done on a certain population that's considered normal, and then it's presumed that the product, if it works for this population, will work for anyone. And that presumption is often, I mean, it's white people who the product is tested on, right? And so this is actually not a new problem. In fact, the same kind of problem historically has arisen in photography and film, you know, for over 100 years. So roughly the film processing techniques were designed to make white people not over or underexposed, but to look really good. So Kodak did this, for example, in the 50s. And so people of color would sometimes not be able to be seen in pictures. They'd be literally invisible or show up as distorted in color. And so I feel like it's the same kind of problem, and that's just one way, you know, stereotypes can, you know, this idea that certain population is normal. It's a problem that happens also in medical design and sex. So, you know, medical testing, anyway, I can go on and on about this, but it's not just about race. But the point is, like, the algorithm, that kind of injustice, it's part of a historical pattern. So it's not new. And this is part of the negligence involved in the design process.
And yeah, sorry, go for it.
To answer your question, I think, I mean, so like the process, right, like the pipeline of like how these things are designed, right, and developed and deployed is full of design choices. And I think, and you know, their design choices, right, are so many that I think it would actually be quite a miracle to actually avoid problems like throughout, right? I really, like, by now, I don't, my default is to assume, right, that technology is going to be problematic somewhere because of all of these places in the design and development of technology, right? So now, for me, actually, you know, the burden of proof is on somebody else to show me that your technology actually didn't suffer from any of these issues. And so you know, there's many of them, right? So one of them is just like, what is the problem you're solving for, right, in the beginning, right? How did you formulate the problem? Another could be, well, most of these systems require a lot of training data, right? They require tons of data. And there's problems with that too, right? That are not just about discrimination, but like consent, right? Did people get, you know, consent for people's data to be included? This is why artists now are like, you know, having a lot of conversations, right, about like, okay, like these people are benefiting from my art, right, in the training data for these things. But the training data, right, comes from the world we live in, right, and the world is not a fair and a just place, and so the training data itself is not, right. So you can imagine if you wanted to do predictive policing, right, like, I mean, first you could ask, should this be a problem that we want to solve, right? And maybe you could stop right there, because I think many people might say we should stop right there. But even if you wanted to, right, even if you wanted to say, oh, I want to use historical arrest data to help me predict where I should send police, well, I mean, historical arrest data is not like a very particularly fair record of like where crimes happen, right? Like police go to very particular places. And so that kind of historical injustice is going to be fed into the model, right? So the systems will learn kind of based on these patterns. And so if all the police in the past were sent to these particular neighborhoods, and then the model will say, okay, you should send police to these neighborhoods because this is apparently where crime happened, right? And so this is sort of, where training data kind of sets, right? Like you can think of like the defaults, right, for kind of what happens. Then you can imagine like, sort of like how you set up the model, right? So for what it should be solving for. So, for example, there's famous cases. I think healthcare is actually a really good setting. There's famous case in like healthcare where systems were designed to predict who should kind of how to allocate treatment to people, right? Who should get healthcare, and I think this was in the U.S. Of course, many of these examples, not to be copied, happened in the United States. But the thing that they were trying to model, was they were trying to minimize treatment cost. That was what they saw as success, right? Is treatment cost. But then you imagine, right? Like what kinds of patients might require very expensive treatment, right? Perhaps people who have experienced poor health in the past. What kinds of people might suffer from poor health in the past? Well, maybe people who have been who live in neighborhoods without access to good water and air and things like that. People who have not been able to go to the doctor in the past, right? And so actually, it ended up over allocating treatments to already healthy people who are also socioeconomically privileged, right? So this is where people didn't realize it, they didn't think about it, right? They didn't really think about this context, this historical context of what's the social context around the cost of these things? But actually there's so much, right, context around the cost, and making that choice, right, caused kind of the system to kind of optimize, right, to focus on the exact wrong thing.
And is it because you're both pointing to historical injustices that get into the algorithm, but is there something in the algorithm itself that enlarges the cost of it as compared to normal human historic maltreatment of other people? What's different about, is there something different about this specific tech side of discrimination?
Yeah, that's a good question. So an algorithm will tend to amplify the things that are seen in the training data. So it's trying, trying is maybe giving it too much agency, but it is being trained, to do a good job according to however a good job is defined, and that good job is defined in the context often of what it's seen in the past, right? And so the small differences in the training data, maybe small differences between people, right? The model might really lean on those more in kind of figuring out how it should be making its decisions. And so even fairly small differences, right? Kind of inequities kind of in training data will tend to get amplified. And of course, algorithms also, right, they don't have capacity to reason, so they're not going to intervene and do anything differently, right? They're not going to look at the situation by themselves and say, we should, rethink how we're doing this, right? So the default very much only goes one way.
Yeah. And is stereotyping always wrong?
I think I have something to add to
go for it.
Sulin's comment about, is there anything different? Certain algorithms have a very big microphone. I'm standing here with my microphone. So, for example, Google search engine, for example. Sophia Noble has this beautiful book, Algorithms of Oppression. And one of the examples she gives in that book is she types in, she's a black woman from the United States, she types in black girls to Google search engine, and what pops up is a bunch of basically pornography, sexualizing, that's all she sees. And so again, Google search engine is something that is used and seen pervasively across the world. And so, this is just, one maybe thing that's different from the past. Again, it's called the Jezebel stereotype, that what she was saying. And again, this has been the subject of critique since the abolition movement in slavery. So again, it's not new stereotype per se, but the microphone that these sort of powerful algorithms have is it's just like a different scale of things. Yeah.
Right. And then, are stereotypes always bad? Or is bias always bad? Is that a bad thing?
Well, one example, to think about if we're talking about Google search engine. So I typed in doctor, last night. And well, there's certain things you can correct in the search engine. So, for example, Noble now kind of talks to and works with Google to try to prevent those images from coming up so high in the feed. But anyway, there used to be a problem where you type in doctor and you get a bunch of men, old men, usually white, in coats with a stethoscope. Okay, so now you can all do this on your phones later. You go into Google search engine, you put in doctor, and you'll have this beautiful picture of diversity in terms of genders, people of all colors and ethnicities, and that is intentional. But still there's an element of stereotyping because all of the people in the picture have their white coats on with the stethoscopes, and doctors refer to this as the white coat stereotype. And there's a lot of discussion in this community about how, especially for women and doctors of color and doctors with other marginalized identities, it is essential to put that white coat on before you meet with patients because it's seen as your marker of credibility. So, just to have a white coat and a stethoscope, I don't know that's morally problematic per se, but I think there can be some context where it does sort of raise ethically kind of interesting kind of issues. Yeah.
Sulian, we're passing the mic. It's Amsterdam. I have different associations. But are biases useful for algorithms?
Useful for whom?
Well, that's the question, I guess. Well, do algorithms like bias?
I'm looking at the other technologists I know in the room. I know you train models. No, they're useful for models in the sense that when models are trained, they're looking for any signal in the training data that they can lean on. I keep wanting to say things like they think, but they don't. But that are going to be informative, so that they can accomplish the goal that they're set, right, which is to optimize something. And so. So as I said, in the previous answer, right, things that whatever is in training data, whatever is there, they will lean on because they don't know. They're incapable of distinguishing between the signals that we care about and the signals that we don't care about, right? And they're incapable of distinguishing, for example, whether the white coats are a thing that are a signal that they should or should not be paying attention to, right? Or whether skin color or hair length or other kinds of things in pictures, right, are things that they should or should not be paying attention to. So in that sense, in a very technical sense, biases are useful to models in that they provide a signal that seems informative, and this is why you have to do extra work, right, to make them no longer informative. I don't know if that answers your question.
I don't know either. For now it does. I want to get back to the both of you. Naomi, the case is still going on. It's basically, it's still there. It's a never-ending story. Why does it take so long?
First of all, because we spend a year trying to complain at the university itself. That's already a year down. And then because of the complexity of the case, because they never dealt with this type of discrimination, and it took a lot of steps to unpack that. What does it mean for a facial detection algorithm to discriminate? How do you prove that? What type of benchmarks do you use? That discussion. And also because we never have access to what the machine thought when Robin was taking her exam, right? So you'll never know that. You have to have the statistical discussion of on average or on aggregate. How does the system perform with different populations, et cetera, et cetera. But you do not have access to this system because, of course, it's a proprietary corporate product that is sold to these public institutions. And that's, of course, a massively complicating factor.
And what are the, I mean, you've been working on this for a while. What are the more systematic wrongdoings that you found along the way? Or maybe what surprised you in this process?
Well, to me, I think the biggest lesson or thing to take from this case is on learning from it what it means to challenge this type of algorithmic discrimination. Because if we look at the discrimination itself, the racism, as Erin already explained, is pretty basic and it's pretty well known that facial detection software, facial recognition software is, in comparison to white faces, pretty bad in recognizing or detecting black or brown faces. So that's not new. And that's also not, in that sense, the lesson to take from this case. But it did show me a lot in what it means to try to take this on in a broader sense. And to explain that, I think it's really useful to take a step back and to look at the work of Sarah Ahmed, as a scholar who worked a lot on this question, like the institutional response to complaints. She says a lot, but if I try to summarize it in one sentence, is if you try to raise a problem with an institution, at some point in the dynamic, you become the problem in the eyes of the institution. And if we look at the Robin's case and this entire situation, this resonates also a lot with the notion of hypervisibility or hyperinvisibility, as is developed over many years now in critical race studies and feminism, which hints at a paradox that the characteristic, race, perceived race, is both the thing that makes you hyper visible in society, how you're judged for it, that's what you're reduced to, that's what you're seen as well as it makes you hyper invisible, because this is exactly the characteristic that marginalizes you, that makes you being ignored or rendered invisible in society. And if we take these things and look at the case, for me, a lot of things become clear, because this is exactly what happened to her. Because at the start with the software, she was literally invisible. Face not found, there is no person here. But she was not only invisible for the software, but also for the institution, because the harm was not visible. It was impossible to file a complaint. She was not heard, not seen, not recognized in what she experienced, until she forced it. She forced them to listen to her, and then the dynamic completely changed, because now we're in a situation where this public institution is defending, with lawyers and everything they have, is defending this corporate software, and she is the threat. She is the problem. So to me, it shows a lot about what it takes in a wider context, regardless of the technology, of the danger also in trying to point out and challenge these systems, but also that if we do look at the technological systems, that we cannot isolate it, and that you have to look at the entire institutional context and what it costs, or who can and cannot challenge or negotiate these things.
I was also wondering, because the universities are slow, or they don't accept a complaint. In the end, they're forced to. But have they changed anything in the software they use, for example?
As far as I know, no. I know that, for example, the UvA, where basically at now it still has it at several faculties as the default option. Like if there's ever going to be another lockdown or that type of situation, it's still standing policy at some faculties to resort to this specific software. And other universities have said, for the procurement of new software, we're going to ensure that this doesn't happen again. And that's great, of course, but I haven't seen anything to actually confirm that or what the language is, because this is also great to say in abstract and in general, but I think you two can tell us perfectly well why it's not that simple. You need to be very clear and very specific about what the criteria are and who is setting these criteria.
Yeah. And we'll get to that as well, unless you want to respond to that. Nay, okay, very good. Yeah, go for it.
So I'm at the University of Utah, and there's a researcher there, William Smith, and he has introduced the concept. It's called racial battle fatigue. And the phenomenon is basically being a person of color in a world that's set up to make you hypervisible or invisible or always disrespect you, is like being in a war zone. And so it's this constant source of stress and just, so he looks at the kind of health impacts over the long term. So it's not just that in this one instance, you go to log into the exam, that this is some kind of isolated harm because you can't access your exam, and this is really stressful, but this is compounded in innumerable ways over the whole course of your life. So I think that's important to keep in mind too. And it's not just this individual, it's sort of across the group. So yeah, I don't know.
Well, I guess
I do have actually this is actually a separate point, but I think one thing that is so striking to me about these sorts of like facial recognition cases, right, is that like here, right, you're interested in making sure that this system doesn't discriminate against some students, right, because non-discrimination is like something that we should all want. But it should also, I think, be a moment where we ask, like, do we want these proctoring services and surveillance systems to be operating in the first place, right? I think this is something that a discussion that's actually happening a lot. And facial recognition is like maybe like the number one situation where I hear this discussion happening is like, are you, I mean, obviously, like in the immediate, like, like near term, it's like super important to ensure, right, like that the student, right, is not suffering discrimination here. But like we can also ask ourselves, right, like do we want a world with more fair like surveillance systems, or do we want to dismantle the facial record, like the surveillance systems, right? And I think there's this, it always reminds me of the importance of like the lenses that we're kind of putting on and like what we're asking about these things, right? Because sometimes when people say, I want to create, like this still happens at computer vision conferences all the time, right? I'm making like a more fair like surveillance system, and you're like, okay, but that means like more people are going to be accurately like surveilled, like more people are going to be visible, right? For like, is this the actual like the world that we want, right? And so I think these are also maybe opportunities to ask questions about like, should we be like, I mean, is proctoring, like we're forcing anybody to like use a camera, like the way that you want to like run your educational system to begin with, right? And so I think, yeah, for me, this is just something that is so striking about this case.
I fully agree with that, because that's for us also one of the things we keep running into, because the first and foremost point is you want to abolish these type of systems, but not just the type of systems, but also the type of education they reveal we have, right? One based on distrust, more based on diplomas as a commodity. So you need to ensure the value of that commodity, and that's why fraud is bad. It's not about learning, it's about this certificate that you buy and has value. So I fully agree with that. But then the difficulty of how do you marry that, or how do you strategically do that while actually fighting the racism you do see in a context where
it's like what claims are legible, right? Even that you can make.
Yeah, and then the response to it always being like, oh, okay, bad that this happened, but that's not racism, because the system is objective. So it can't possibly be racism. And then you get into a whole nother layer of like,
why is that such...
I'm sensing that drinks afterwards are going to be fun.
Yeah. But why is that such a hard notion to get rid of, that the system is not racist?
Yeah, tell me. But it's like really, really the basic response we have been keep getting, that it's systems are objective, they cannot think, they do not have intention, and it's a very specific notion of what racism is, right? Because it's also like systemic racism doesn't exist. The only type of racism or sexism or whatever type of ism is the one with someone with a malintent does something maliciously to cause harm.
Yes, and like just to build on that, not only is racism historically a concept that has been articulated in individualistic psychological terms, and so that's the most familiar to a lot of people, it's also built into the legal frameworks. So in the United States and sort of in many places, there are two kinds of discrimination, so two kinds of ways you can get relief. There's sort of, you can use the laws that prohibit direct discrimination, and there often you have to prove intent. If the machine does not have intent to discriminate, doesn't have beliefs, it's not racist, because it can't have mental states, then I don't know. I mean, it's hard to, so the other kind of discrimination law that, you can show that a sort of policy or practice disparately impacts, so hurts a protected class. But in the United States, this kind of discrimination law is basically useless because judges don't see it as legitimate.
That's the type of,
Sorry, you don't need it.
I have my Britney Spears mic. Because that's that second category of indirect discrimination. That's the basis for this case. But that's also the interesting part in how do you get there? How do you prove that? And then, because there is this basis of, okay, if you can prove, even if the rule or the thing that's happening is on face value equal, neutral, but if the impact is disparate, okay, then it still counts as discrimination. But then what counts as impact? And that comes back to also the health point you made earlier. What type of harm is legible in this case? Is it only the couple of seconds that it takes for you to enter the exam later? Is it the possible fraud suspicion you have more? Or is it the stress that you experience? Is it the lamp in your face? Like, what counts as harm in this context? Is it the broader racist world you live in and what that does to you? It's also very limited in a legal sense.
Do you think, sorry, Celine, to interrupt you or go before you, do you think all of this, the algorithm and the algorithmic injustice, could also be a chance, like an opportunity for our fight against institutional racism to be brought to the attention in a different light, maybe with different powers, where it could sort of be a case for the good? Or is that way too optimistic?
I'm a cranky person by nature, but I also do actually think that when algorithms are introduced, right, in society, they are really important opportunities for dialogue and for reflection, right? Because every time you're taking something and automating it, right, there's an opportunity for you to say, did I want to do that thing in the first place? And if I did, how do I want to do that, right? What values do I carry with me as I do that, right? And there's lots of questions you could ask, right? If I want to automate welfare, allocation, you can ask yourself the question of, do I want a system that is the business of allocating welfare to begin with in a particular way, right? And so if you don't do this, right, the alternative is that the algorithm just automates what the previous system was, and that's worse because it entrenches the thing that you already had, which is usually not the thing we really want. So I do think that and of course the difficulty is, we often don't know when these algorithms are introduced, so it's not always that it's obvious that we can, step in and as a public, say something. But I do think every time anybody is thinking of automating something, it is a moment to say, hang on, wait, is this a system? Is this the task we wanted to solve in the first place, right? Is this the system that we wanted to have, or did we want to change that, right? Do we like, how we handle our borders, right? Do we like how we handle our, I don't know, whatever, right? Every moment of automation is also a moment to step back and reflect on what values you want to carry in a system.
Do we, though? Because there's something in technology and automation that is just going for it, and we are sort of lacking behind, it seems. Do we take a step back? Really?
Who's the we?
Well, okay, you are academics, so you obviously do.
Yeah. I said should, right? I mean, this is easier said than done, right? Because I think it's very in practice, right? It's very difficult if there's no transparency in when these things are being kind of developed or deployed, right? And your case is kind of unique because there's you're actually aware that the system is being used, right? Because she directly had to, fight with this stupid camera and the light and the everything. But it sounds right, for you it's very the opposite case, and that there's actually no sense that this thing is even happening until you're facing the effects of it.
No, I think in general for journalists it's really complicated right now because it's very hard for us to know what's there, and even once I learned about these specific algorithm that Janneke also spoke about today, the ProKit, then it comes every year. They have a new version. It has a new name and it has a new number behind it. And every time I ask a question, it's just a pilot. So please don't speak about it now. It's not yet working.
So you're always behind the facts. So we work a lot with WOP. I don't know if, I guess in English it's called FOI, Freedom of Information Request. But if I don't know the name of the algorithm, then I'm not going to get it. And it takes me a year to get the Freedom of Information Request anyway. So it's really hard to find out what's going on. It's really hard to be critical. And I can completely connect to what you're talking about, because also for us as storyteller, if you go to your chief editor, then he says, yeah, okay, but we want an example. We need a person that can say that this is happening. How? There is no list. Nobody is ever going to release the list of kids or the mothers. There is no union of these mothers because they don't know each other. So the story from a narrative perspective for us as kind of people who can report about it, it remains invisible.
Did you get a reaction from the municipality or the police, or how did? Okay, explain the smile.
No, it did. So the film came out in IDFA, which is in Amsterdam. So it was kind of a home play. It was good, and I'm very, very lucky. Also in terms of research, it was really hard to research this. So it had to be a very multidisciplinary research because you need a lot of technical knowledge. You also need someone who's really legally versed. So I was very lucky to kind of have a little team with me that was interested anyway. So when the film came, everybody came out on their own field. And the mayor of Amsterdam wrote a letter, I think 5 or 6 days later, a 9-page letter. Probably a lot of people worked, where she completely stands behind it. She had a lot of sympathy for the film and for the mothers. She was very complimentary to the film, but she completely said, we are standing behind this.
Standing behind the algorithm that we use.
Behind the program that's called the Top. But we met them also, they invited us for a meeting. And I think what struck me the most in this meeting, that was the only question I had, was, did you ever evaluate the program? So the program works from 2015 or 14. And they said that they released data. They released those pie charts with statistics of crime every year. And we said, no, did you ever evaluate it? Did you ever take people like you and let them, kind of look at it and talk to the mothers and talk to everybody else? And they said no. And what I thought about is that they were so convicted that they're trying to help, and they were so convicted that they're doing something so good that they just never evaluated it. And I thought something so simple would, kind of maybe bring out what is the narrative. It's a narrative for me. For me, it was a narrative fight. It was, I'm saying this and we're saying that. It's very important that the people won't think that we're doing something wrong. But there was no mechanism of evaluation, and there is no mechanism of update and control.
Which brings us to the point of accountability. Who's accountable in this case? And who's taking?
Also very, very difficult. Again, as a journalist, it's so difficult. Yeah. And there's a lawyer involved, and we were sitting in a room, and he said, so who do we sue? Kind of, the algorithm works on police data, so it's completely police thing. The city hall is using it, but child services is also involved, and they are sharing data, so it's a lot of welfare and policing data combined, which in the movie I kind of aimed at that, at the idea that you should not combine welfare and policing in such a way when it comes to algorithms and data. But it is very difficult. It's very difficult to decide, even for me and with the camera, to decide who do I go to interview, because everybody I interviewed, they all knew a little piece of they all had a little piece of the story to tell, and that doesn't make a great story, of course. So I was like, okay, how do you...
This is also because you told me, we spoke a little before, and you said it was very hard for you to find a form to tell the story.
Yes, from a storytelling perspective, I think this is a very interesting question, because we're used to tell the power. What our chief editors want is personal stories, human stories, human interest. So the pain of a mother is very easy to understand. But go explain someone what's an algorithm doing. How can an algorithm stand in the system is very hard to portray. So you have to. I think it's for us now to think, how are we able to visualize what's happening in systems, because that narrative is very important and it's quite real. There is a reality that is being determined somewhere else, and what we can see is maybe the impact, which we can't prove that the impact is that. So I think there are quite a few interesting groups of journalists working mainly in multidisciplinary ways in order to be able to tell the story in a way that's accessible to a crowd.
Sulin, you also work at Microsoft. And when we're talking about accountability, I was wondering, where is the accountability in the corporate organizations and in the... Yeah, well, you knew it was coming.
It isn't. So yeah, I mean, so I think about this a lot, right? Because I think one of many challenges to kind of grappling with these technologies, right, is like where they're developed and where they're deployed, right? And sometimes it's in governments, and the governments are unwilling to like tell you a lot about what's happening. Sometimes they're proprietary, right? And for the most part, I think they're proprietary, right? So like, they're made by tech companies, often very large tech companies, that are just unwilling to share the secret sauce, right? Because they see it as, like their kind of proprietary information. And this is, I think, particularly so, this is really accelerated in a particular way because a lot of modern systems. First of all, I should say, many systems that can cause harm, you don't need a fancy system to cause harm, right? This algorithm here almost certainly was not very fancy and it caused a lot of harm. So there's no obligation that a system be fancy for it to be harmful. But systems like, for example, ChatGPT or things like that, right? Very kind of these very new shiny technologies depend so much on compute data, training data that only large companies have. And so this is really concentrating, right, like power and resources, right? And it's kind of concentrating decision-making power in the hands of a very few people who are getting to decide what's in the training data, how do we design the model, like how do we release it, who gets access to it, who gets to evaluate it, right? And they're also being very cagey about like releasing this information to the public. So I think accountability becomes very difficult when you don't have a lot of levers for asking things like what's in the training data. Can I see whether my images are in it, right? No, you can't, sorry. Can I find out how the technology is being used, right? Like what are the kinds of use cases that people are using it for? Like, algorithms that people are using for hiring. Well, if you're the job applicant, you never get to see this, right? Like, you didn't get the job, you didn't know, but you don't know why. So a lot of things are just not available, I think, right, to the public or to kind of policy, to regulators, anything. And I think it's very difficult, right, for the public even to make a stink, because if you don't know the algorithm is operating, you don't know, then there's nothing to say, right? There's nothing you can bring to anyone. So I think there's a lot, I think, for me, I've been thinking about, what accountability might require, like what information we might need, and what we might want to demand, right, from kind of large tech companies, and then also what levers we need, right, what incentives, because I think we can probably agree that like self-governance is not like a good like future, like, like permanent strategy for large tech companies. So kind of, and this is something I would love also to talk with, hear the rest of the thoughts from everybody on this panel, right? Is like, what are the incentives? What are the levers that we could use to kind of make this happen?
Yeah, and before we get to that, I just want to see if there's any questions in the room. Not about solutions, because we're going to get there. There we go. Ik loop af.
To blame a victim, I think we also need to blame the education department, because we are all educated. We educate all those IT guys learning the algorithms, but if you say you can use it only for the good way or whatever, then there's a stop. We need to say no to things. No, we don't want this. No, it's possible technology, but we don't want it as a society.
What's your question?
Now, if there's somebody to blame, there's not only technology in the big companies, but also the education.
Do you think educational institutions should be, dankjewel, blamed? Or have a responsibility in preventing algorithms or designers to be racist, basically?
Yes, strong yes. I'm a philosophy professor, and one of the things that I do is teach ethics. But interestingly, in the United States at least, this is I feel like, there's like a pressure to keep students on very narrow tracks so that they're job prepared. You know, so what this does in effect, like in my university, it means that general education has been slashed, which means people who come in who want to be computer science majors, you know, there are a lot of courses they need to take. There's not much wiggle room, but now they're not required to basically take as many kind of outside like humanities courses, ethics courses, history courses, things that would help them understand the context that they are operating in and some of the historical problems associated. So I don't know, I feel like universities could, again, this is like a profit thing, you know, like it's good to show that like you're anyway, but I can get on my little horse and like rock back up and down here for a while, but I think that yes, the values that we have, if we want algorithms to be more equitable, if we want the world to be more equitable, that's something that, I mean, it's impossible K through 12 in the, well, I'm going to just stop right there, but, you know, universities for sure.
Since you mentioned profit, though, I mean, I think the thing that I see, though, is that like industry is actually full of a lot of really well-meaning people, many of whom are actually well-educated or somewhat well-educated, right? I agree that in general, education in these areas is lacking, especially because a lot of these insights, so some of the history is very old, but some of these new insights about how these technologies work are new. But technology, the industry is full of well-meaning people who are unable to kind of make any kind of difference, right? Because like when in a battle between kind of like profit incentives and everything else, the profit incentives will win, right? And I think, you know, so I do my research, right? I try to say, oh, okay, here's a new, you know, measurement, here's a new benchmark, here's a new thing to test your system, all these things, but like, all of these things do you no good unless you are given the time and the resources and the investment to actually do them, right? But like if you have to ship first, you have to ship first. And so it's, you know, I like to imagine, I like education and I like to imagine that education will bring about a better world. But I think, you know, even everybody's best intentions get sacrificed right on the altar of kind of profit incentives in the end.
And I do agree with the notion that education, of course, will help. I mean, educating people better, of course, a good idea. But I do think that the question itself or the framing already approaches it again as a tech problem or a design problem. If only these systems would be designed better, then we would have the solution. Even though in our cases, like there's no tech problem. Like in the education context, you have to ask: is this the type of education we want? Do we want this distrust diploma factory type education? And in the documentary, for me, like the biggest point was, why did no one ever ask these parents what they needed? Like that might be perhaps a good idea or a good way to solve the societal problem, and not how can we design this algorithm better, or what questions should we ask ourselves with designing this algorithm.
Can I ask you a question? How much money was spent on the development of that system that could have been allocated elsewhere?
It reminded me of the $1 million block research, where they have calculated how much it costs to put one person in prison for a year, and they projected it on the cities where they came from, and they found out that in some buildings in New York, they're spending more than $1 million a year on incarceration. These kind of questions we ask ourselves when we looked at this system, which is very lucrative also. But I have a problem a bit with the binary of good and bad. As someone who educates people, I think it's very hard to know what will happen with technology, because it's such a creative field. Actually, I think the only way is to have enough access for journalists, academics, reflection, in order for people to kind of reflect on what's happening, because we really don't know. I can tell you that in the system that I have researched, I really do believe that the people who created it have really, really believed that they're doing something good. So the idea of good and bad there, that indicator wouldn't work.
Yeah, the government is not presenting. That was the first kickoff, and but they are aware of the situation. I attended a meetup 2 weeks ago about this subject with government people from national level and local level, and we had hard discussions.
Yes.
And that was exactly my reason to attend. That they are not now here is a little bit sad. because they have a lot of power. And the most frustrating for me, and there was also people who was involved from the Toeslagenaffaire. There was a woman sitting next to me, and they tell from first hand what happened with your life. It's destroyed.
Yes.
That you try to imagine. I can. But the sad thing after this meetup, it was said that on the Tweede Kamer, is a new proposal to even more to create an algorithm now to prove it that will be more harmful than the toeslagen algorithm. What the fuck? Do we learn anything?
Are we learning anything? Are we making any kind of progress? Do you see any kind of progress needed? I mean, you made an impactful documentary. Do you see it getting anywhere in terms of change within that system?
I relate to something you said just before. It's when we started working on it, the people who were wishful, they were talking to us about how to fix it. And at one moment, Jelle Klaas, who's the lawyer who works on it, he said, I don't want to fix it. I want it to stop. and then you get into this fixing conversation where people are like, okay, come and talk to us. And also, we're journalists, we're not getting paid. We're invited to all these meetings and we're sitting everywhere giving people information that they should actually acquire themselves. But so we became specialists on algorithms for governments, which is quite amazing. But the mentality is okay, so maybe we should take this fader down, and the existential questions are not being asked because everybody's saying it's political. She's never going to take it off, so let's just give them the feedback that they want. And then you find yourself playing a game that you don't actually want to. You're kind of compromising in the conversation. But more than that, since I did this, I'm in contact with other people who have made research other algorithms, and we're finding out other patterns which are very worrisome. For example, in my film, the women in my film, half of them were also in the Toeslagenaffaire and in the fraud affair. So we find out that there's so much data on a certain group in society, where a lot of welfare data, that there's so many algorithms attacking the same group. So an algorithm to find out who's doing fraud with uitkering, with how do you say uitkering in English? With social benefits. And who's doing fraud with the child support, and whose child is in risk for crime. And it's actually all the same very weak socioeconomic group who produces a lot of data. So it's kind of fun to make algorithms for it because you have a lot of data to work with. So the opposite, I feel that everybody's aware of it and everybody's saying, we're fixing the biases, we're making a new version. Will you come talk to us? Can you help us train the model better? But now, after many meetings, I'm quite hopeless.
Can you tell us something about that new project you're working on?
Well, right now we're just trying to create a kind of a simulation of ProKit, because the film was about the Top 400, which is a program, but indeed to try to find language to make a more visual and a more tangible understanding of this, what we call the algorithmic reality.
Celine, are we getting better? Are we making progress?
I think public awareness of these issues, right, is changing. But I also think these the speed at which some of these technologies are coming out is really evidence that, like, it's still it's not considered by the people who are developing these technologies serious enough to slow down, right, or to stop, right? And so technologies like ChatGPT and then GPT-4 and Bard and other things, right, like, are coming out at, like, truly breakneck pace. Everybody wants to beat out everybody else, right? People are developing things because they can, or because they want to do it before the other tech company, right? Or they don't want to be too far behind the other tech company. And so I don't really see that as evidence that, like, you people are saying, hang on, like, should we be doing this in the first place? Like, if so, then let's take the time that we would need to, like, invest, right, significant time to figure out what the issues are. Especially because we know what the issues are. Right? People have been writing about these things for years now, right? So some of them. So it's not as though there's like no groundwork that we can use to anticipate the problems, right? And so like we already know that the default is that we should be anticipating problems. And so at this point, I think if you're just releasing stuff into the world, like it is evidence, right, that you are unwilling, I think, to take the time to invest and to think about whether we should be building these things in the first place. And I think, to the earlier point, I think even if, individual technologies here and there feel maybe better, less awful, I think it is very hard to meaningfully say that we've learned or things are better if we don't change the overall kind of social structures producing these things, right? Like if it continues that only a few governments or tech companies are making these things, I cannot really meaningfully say that we have learned, right? Because the decision-making ability is still not with us, right, kind of collectively.
I think one thing that worries me is also the wider context, because I think you're right that most of these problems are known and is written about it, and people are working on it, but not enough. But it's also the wider context of this dependency on these corporate products. Is not only the software itself, it's the data, it's the full infrastructure, and more people are also working on that. Most notably also Seda Gorses has been driving that point home, is this broader social dependency on corporate infrastructures in all these different sectors, from education to our governments to everything running on a couple of companies' infrastructure. And if you combine that with then what you see very clearly in your case and the other case we discussed, this political, single-minded right-wing focus on fraud prevention, on safety, and you get this toxic marriage in welfare, in migration, in education, targeting the same people over and over again. So that wider context, not only the technology itself, really worries me.
Before we're going to talk more about the solutions, are there any more questions from the room at this point? Yay! There we go. I saw hands here, but oké. Ik kom even achter je staan. Sorry, bedankt. Kan je je naam noemen en je question?
Yes, my name is Nigel. I have a question for Nirit. You mentioned that the police used several methods to check which juvenile kids would be at risk to become criminal. And one of those methods was using an algorithm, right? Mm-hmm. So I was wondering if you think or if you know if taking that method out of the whole process would make the whole system or the whole process fairer.
So delete the algorithm. Is that a fairer process? Is that your question?
Yeah. That would lead to a fairer, get rid of the algorithm and just leave it to human judgment. Would that lead to a fairer, how do you say it? Yeah, like fairer pick on, that kid would be a criminal and that kid would be a criminal.
Great question. Thank you.
I think that's a really good question. I think it actually happened in this case because the Top 400, which is a program that's run in Amsterdam, stopped using. So they really decided we're not going to use the algorithm anymore because it created too many problems explaining to parents how and why are their kids on the list. And it created two classes of kids. The kids who came through the algorithms were much lighter in their interface with police. And I guess Fika, she's one of the researchers we work with, she always said, the algorithms are not the problem, it's the diversion. We should talk about the policy that drives them. And of course it doesn't, because of course the algorithm was especially bad because we could not even come behind the kind of calculations it made or why are these kids there. But I still think that this risk calculation way of thinking, and like you said, actually it's a very simple algorithm because it's more or less kind of a check system. You still look at very, very weak kids who have a lot of disadvantages with a projection of risk. And you ask yourself, what are they going to do wrong? And you say, I'm going to help them, but you also put them in this. Only being on the list is already quite a discriminatory effect on someone. So no, I think your question actually happened, and we are seeing it now, and we're thinking, okay, you took the algorithm out, but you're still doing the same thing, just now with hands, with people. And you have to understand that also the data that's collected on such a kid is coming from so many sources. It's not like the people who wrote the data are there. Then you just get this. I read those reports. It's so badly written. And that data become that kid. And it's a place where, you know, a million civil workers have made notes about the family and what the family has done. And then someone looks at it and says, okay, now this kid is going on the list.
Well, yeah, I had a little follow-up. I get your point. Because an algorithm is just an automation of, we can say a checklist, for example, if it's a simple algorithm. So, yeah, instead of getting the algorithm out and letting the police workers just check every box, is, I think, exactly the same.
Yeah. Is there a difference, is the question, between an algorithm and the judgment?
Well, Fika will not agree with me, but I think there is a difference, yeah. Because the algorithm is still scanning much bigger data, and I think that the kids I've met that came through the welfare system, I think there was more knowledge about exactly what kind of care they need. And it was much more shocking for kids who came through the algorithm. It was also shocking for the family because they never had any interface with welfare or... You know, it's very different if a social worker that knows you says, I'm going to send you to this list, than if suddenly someone knocks on the door and says, we have a letter for you.
Is there a good way to use an algorithm in this case?
I asked myself that, and I don't have the answer. I could notice a few things that a lot of the mothers I've met, but again, I didn't do statistics. I only talked to 15 women out of 1,000, so it's not that many. But most of them who were treated by the algorithm, the knock on the door came when they were really in trouble. So I thought, so the algorithm somehow is recognizing some kind of stress because they appear in all the systems and they have a lot of contact with welfare systems and policing. I guess it is a sign of something is going wrong. I just don't know if you can win the discriminatory level. I don't know if the state should be so deep in people's lives, and I don't know if we're trying to help.
I saw more hands, but I lost them. Oh, there we go. Okay.
So my question was more around the technological side of this debate slightly. You talked about predictive policing. You talked about software being proprietary. We treat it as a black box. You feed in somebody's information. You get the likelihood that they are going to commit a crime or not. More recently, America is perhaps the biggest example where they have such black box systems. And New Jersey recently had a judgment where the court actually told someone who was caught by a system that suspected them of armed robbery, a facial recognition system that we were talking about, that you need to provide the person with the model weights, how it's constructed, what's the error ratios. My question is, do you think that in such critical systems, this black box, this proprietary nature is part of the problem? When you're putting such major systems, people should have, at least the public that's going to be at the receiving end of the consequences of these systems should be able to inspect them. They should be open source. They should be publicly distributed. They should be audited by security experts. So do you think that this discussion, even though it is a bit technological, it's about some property of the system rather than its behavior in terms of fairness, is this something very desirable? And maybe we should try to step away from such proprietary systems as Naomi was talking about, these facial recognition systems. Nobody really knows what's triggering their perception of fraud happening or a student's cheating. Is this happening?
Who are you asking the question to?
I think it would be for Sulen, because I think it's the Microsoft and the big proprietary jungle. So
thank you.
I can start, but I also think probably everybody on this panel would have good answers to this. Yeah, so I think there's a couple things. I think one, there are some systems where the harms so outweigh the benefits that the question of whether it's a black box is almost secondary because you should just decide not to have the system at all. So I think facial recognition, by and large, is one of these types of systems where like looking into what it's doing and trying to figure out why it's making the decisions that it's making are almost like secondary. Just get rid of it. But I think there's like maybe a much larger class of systems where like there are some benefits and we might be potentially excited about some of these benefits. For example, like large language models or something, right? Where like there's a lot of applications that people are genuinely excited about. And so you don't want to throw the whole thing, you probably don't want to throw the whole thing out. And then the question becomes like, what should be made publicly available and like what purposes would it serve, right? And I think there's a lot of different reasons, reasons you might want different parts of like the black box to be opened, right? I think one is like, there's questions of consent. So if you're worried about like training data or something like this, right, you might want to just open up like data sets so people know, right, like whether their data has been like captured and if they want to like opt out of this process, right? There's interesting technical questions for what that would mean for things like language. How would you even pick like a piece of language that is like yours and like a text data? It's different from images, but like that is a question. Other things are trickier because I think one thing is actually, I think you were distinguishing in your question between like details of how the model is like working versus like the outcomes. But I even think the outcomes are not available to us a lot of the times, right? Because like, like a proprietary translation system, what kinds of documents get translated, run through the system and by whom, and what are the different kinds of failures that we might care about, right? Like I think maybe it doesn't occur to us sometimes that people are using translation systems in like medical settings or like in immigration, like US Customs and Immigration Services, they've been told not to, but they still use Google Translate, like in processing like refugee documents, and the things they get it wrong. And then like, people are getting decisions that are like based on incorrect information because there's mistranslations, right? And so how would we come to know that these things are happening, right? Like we should know that these are happening. So I think even the outcomes are not always like available to us, and so we should maybe want to know like what is the distribution of use cases, right? Like when people are buying access to large language models, what kinds of things are they using it for so that we can anticipate different kinds of failures and we can kind of anticipate how we might want to deal with them. So I even think that should be something. The question about like the model itself, like what we might want to know about like the model is a trickier question because I think we should want to know those things, but those will be the most difficult to maybe like pry, right? Because that's like the secret sauce. And it's also not clear like how, like once you have access to it, how do you be able to use it in a reasonable way to like do meaningful evaluation, right? Like I think there's questions about like what evaluations demand access to the internals versus just like knowing like the outcomes. And I don't know, so I don't work on transparency or interpretability, so full disclosure, so there are people who are in this world who are way better equipped to answer this question than me, but I think there is a question of like, if you gave like the full model weights of like, of GPT-4 to a legislator, would they know, or a regulator, would they know what to do with it? You're shaking your head. So I think there's questions there about like, I think the first question is like, what do we want to know about this? Like, what do we want to know? Like, what evaluation would we demand? And then based on that, what like components of a system, right, would we need access to? So I think we have to start with like, what is it that we want to know in order to make informed decisions first, right? Before we ask like, what kind of technical details do we need?
Oh, you want to? Yeah, go for it. I mean, one thought about why transparency could be helpful. This is an example from Cathy O'Neill in her book, Weapons of Math Destruction. So, I mean, it might help legally because it might help us know when algorithms are using race and gender and other protected traits as heuristics. So, O'Neill talks about this algorithm guild, and so if you kind of look on your phone, guild, you type it in guild algorithm, the first thing that pops up, and one of the things she mentions is it's a hiring algorithm used by employers to give figuring out who they should hire. So it's billed as a way to get rid of discrimination in your hiring process. So that's what you'll find is like basically publicity that this algorithm is liberatory. It will like help you be a more objective decision maker when it comes to your employees. Okay, so that's the hype. But one thing, so O'Neill was like doing some research on this, la-di-da-da, and so she found one of the chief scientists just dropping a really fun fact about the algorithm, which would otherwise be hidden, which was the algorithm was using, so this was specifically for programmers. So one of the metrics they were interested in is social capital because they like want to hire like really well-connected programmers. Anyway, it was using participation on a specific Japanese manga site as a heuristic for social capital because the algorithm somehow figured out that among like well-connected programmers, like lots of people were going here. And so I mean, this was actually used as one of the metrics to judge candidates, but the algorithm just kind of found this information, was using it, whatever. She thought that was super fun. But it's also true that this is sort of a high, I mean, and O'Neill says, this is like a male-dominated space where like people are saying really misogynistic things. It's super unfriendly to you know, queer people, to women, to like, you know, so it's like a metric that sounds fun, but it's clearly anyway, it's going to hurt range of candidates. So it is, in fact, discriminatory. So I don't know. I just feel like if there were some more transparency, it would give at least a little more data to people trying to kind of push back and maybe get more momentum if people knew how often metrics were being used, like, or heuristics were being used that are discriminatory. I mean, if we're thinking about like collective action and kind of getting like really angry and kind of calling your legislator and, you know, that this might help in some way. Yeah.
We're juggling a mic with the three of us now. I lost my mic. Thank you. So the transparency, which is sort of a really nice bridge to solutions and regulations, because that's where we're going. How do we get more transparency? Who should do what, and what should we ask for? I'll start with you, Naomi.
Oh, yeah, I mean, I think one thing we can already really gather from what you two have been saying is there's no such thing as one type of transparency. It depends on the context, it depends on what you want, and I think in very specific contexts, if you're talking about if an algorithm is already used, if you've decided it's a good idea to use an algorithm in a specific legal setting, yes, then it'd be good to know where that decision comes from. But in general, yeah, there are so many layers to what transparency is, right? It's transparency by whom, for whom, in what context, depending on what you want to explain. It can be very useful to know exactly what type of weights are used, of course, but not in every context, because if you're just, using something, you don't want to be overloaded with that type of information.
But when we talk about regulation, because everybody's always like, yeah, we should just regulate, you know? That's such a wide and easy thing to say, but what should we be regulating? Where to start? I'm looking at all of you.
I have something I think about lately. So when we met these women, they all walk around with this, what they call my files, like all this data that's collected about them, the reports. And for example, I don't know if it's everywhere like this, but in Holland, you cannot change your file. You can only put a bezwaar. You can only complain. If you think someone wrote something wrong about you, if you're like, I don't recognize myself in this text, this is not me, this is wrong, you cannot change it. You can only add something to it. And I thought, since everything is data-based, and there's so much data about us, that we should have access to our data, that we should have some agency to edit the data, to see. So what we're doing a lot now in this kind of storytelling is ask people to ask for their data, which is not an easy process. Armed with lawyers and stuff, it's really hard. But I thought maybe that would be a beginning to think how can we at least control our data and know when our data is impacted by something, so we can at least have something to say about it. So right now, the lawyer is ready and he has this idea what he should do, but we don't know who are the people who have been impacted by this algorithm, because they don't know that they have been impacted by the algorithm. So it would be nice, kind of a first thought we had, but I don't know that I know how to go there, but maybe it's...
It starts with a thought. What about you all? Who should we regulate? What should we regulate?
This is in part like a continuation of your thought earlier, kind of about the effectiveness of like discrimination law, right? And like what the law has to say. And I think there are some settings where there is existing like legal sort of machinery, right? So like hiring maybe is like one of those cases, right? And as you say, it's imperfect and like it does not actually protect people all the time when it should, but there is like already machinery that you could at least draw on as an example to say like, okay, like, you know, we maybe have taken a stab at like thinking about how we should measure impact of a system. And so now maybe we can see if it makes sense for like an algorithmic system, right? Maybe it's like a little less of a leap. But then there's many other kinds of things that we have no such machinery to draw on, right? The law doesn't have anything to say. So a lot of impacts of like a large like language model type things, right? We might not really know how to think about, right? A lot of harmful things they could do, right? I mean, stereotyping, what does the law have to say about stereotyping? In the US, it's nothing. What does the law have to say about stereotyping, right? I mean, unless, for example, it like produced like a hiring outcome of some kind or something like that, right? But in and of itself, it's like fine to like spew racist nonsense like online. And so there's questions of like, you know, if there's no legal machinery, should there be legal machinery, right? And like, if so, what it should look like. And these are totally brand new questions. And there's the additional problem that in places like the US, right, like effective regulation or legislation is also non-existent, right? Like this would be like, the Congress is not functioning. This would be like a 10-year project, and like, you know, a lot can change in like 10 years. I like to imagine a world where this is effectively governed, but I also have a hard time imagining concretely like the pathway.
Well, I'll get to you in a second. You were talking about the political reality in the US, but isn't there also something about the magic dust that hangs around tech that we are reluctant to legislate at all? Like, is tech different in that sense than other sectors that we are maybe more keen to regulate?
Yeah, I mean, I think like even before, let's say like the last year or so, all the changes in the last year, I think there have been big problems with big tech, right? That like not too much has happened, right? So like Facebook or Meta, right, has had so many issues, right, with misinformation and causing like really concrete harms in like, you know, elections and like causing strife in like various countries, like in the world, right, is like one example. And we've been reluctant to do anything about that. You could also imagine that Google search, right, or just search in general might have caused many kinds of problems before that, right? Like, you know, well before any kind of like these fancy large language models, right? Like search like has been discriminatory, but there have also like, you know, I'm not really like up on like my, I'm not a legal scholar, but my sense is that like the regulation of this has been not terribly effective or energetic. So I do think there is like a sense in which there is some reluctance to stifle kind of innovation and what is seen as kind of productivity and creativity and efficiency, which all sound like, you know, nice things, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I do agree in the sense that there has been a lot happening in the past few years in governments trying to make an effort in regulating and legislating in the US and also in the EU. There's been a lot coming out, actively trying to do something with these tech harms and make sure that everything goes right according to European values and such. But I think in essence, your diagnosis is correct, that there is some reluctance, and that's exactly what you were saying last, and that this stifling of innovation. We should regulate, we should ensure that there, everything goes right. Yeah, no one wants to be last, but you cannot stifle innovation, and like the basic assumption is that innovation is good and that tech will save us. And like the times of crises we're living in, like first and foremost the climate crisis and everything else we can mention, the basic idea still is, or the alluring appeal of, there is some tech out there that will save us, and we cannot be the last to figure that out in this capitalist world, because then it won't be ours and we can't use it. Then it will be, the US will have it, or the Chinese, God forbid, China could have it, and the EU would be last. So I definitely think that that ideology and that narrative is very strong.
So in addition to, I think, focusing on who's producing the tech, I think there's also a reluctance to regulate some of the consumers of technology, including businesses that want to enhance the productivity, of their workforce by measuring and trying to kind of make sure there's no, we talked about fraud, that people are working, trying to use people's engagement with their cursor, for example, and when people stop, with their mouse, they're kind of considered not working. So you can get flagged as basically, not doing your job. And so the New York Times has run all of these kind of exposés on these sort of exploitative technologies and kind of very invasive private. So anyway, there's also if there's a market for it, then there's a motivation to produce these technologies. And so I don't know, I think unions might be part of the answer, because unions can negotiate to kind of talk about hiring processes. Well, maybe we don't want to use a hiring algorithm that is just a black box. Maybe we want some say about the processes involved. So I think collective governance, and specifically kind of, you can have some more leverage there.
Yeah, connecting to that and to your question on how and who and what to regulate, I think as a legal scholar, I ultimately am quite skeptical of what the law can do and can provide with us. And I want to connect that to the question you asked a bit earlier about, isn't tech also an opportunity in some sense to uncover a type of discrimination and make it visible? And I think that's an argument that's used a lot, now at least we can see it, We never knew that the tax agency in the Netherlands could possibly be discriminatory until we saw this algorithm. Now at least we can see it and we know it's true. And I think ultimately there, again, the question is, for whom is this news, right? I think a lot of people who are on the receiving end of this type of discrimination or inequality are very perfectly aware of the type of world they're living in. And asking about what type of regulation would solve this tech is, I think, also a very, very structural top-down way of thinking about it. It doesn't mean we shouldn't regulate, and I think there's a lot of things we should do. But a starting question could also be actually listening to people who are already trying to communicate what is going wrong.
What other knobs do we have to turn to change this? It's a hard one, right? Are there any questions from the room? Okay, there we go.
Hi, so just a question. What do you think of the AI Act, which has been agreed upon in the European Parliament this week?
Can you maybe explain exactly what it entails?
Well, that's why I haven't read it yet. So I was anticipating this laugh. And that's also why I was hesitant of asking the question. But I think we talked a lot around the issue, and the developments are going quite fast. And so it's important to keep in pace with these things. And if I go back to the non-digital world, I've been a municipal councillor for a couple of years. And so in the regular, so as member of the Public Safety Committee with the mayor and the police. And so there is an annual report. And in that report, there are biases. So to give an example, no, I cannot. So the problem with this is there's always a lot of context. And so to come back to your point on the documentary, I cannot make it a question. It's so now I've lost.
Sorry, I broke your train of thoughts there.
So it's a system, and if you don't look at the whole system, you cannot change it. And so I try to change it in the sense that. So to give an example, children who make too much noise, that's labeled as a crime. And women who are beaten in the weekend, they're somewhere hidden in these statistics. So then if you go to the police, you have another problem, because the police is not oriented towards those kind of cases.
Thank you. I think
this comes before algorithm. And my question is: Are you not? Yeah, it's coming. Are you not making it too complex? Because the world with algorithms is very complex, but it adds a complexity. And then so that's the question.
Okay, who wants to take it? It's an easy question.
I mean, one of the things I do is study liberation movements, historical liberation movements, and often there's this sort of debate within specific movements, whether it's like among feminists or Black liberation movement or whatever, whether like reform or revolution is best. Okay, and so it's like we're kind of like in a burn it all down situation. I think you've heard that theme among us, but there's also like a reform. Yes. I mean, this is a constant discussion across, I don't know, time and place. Yeah, so I think there are reasons. I mean, we've talked about reasons that reform and trying to kind of fix, I don't know. But anyway, the point is, I think you're bringing up this bigger question about, I mean, the easy thing is we need to burn it all down and start again, but that's not really possible. And anyway, this is just repeating. Well, you're like, this problem has been around for a long time. How do we fix it? I'm not very optimistic. But just in pointing to the liberation movements, there are these two options that are in tension.
No, but maybe something that refers to what you're talking about is that what algorithms do and what data does do is it's still zeros and ones, and it doesn't contain all kind of. I think that was for me the biggest takeaway from the process I've been, is that while they educated, it was this machine learning, and it could learn more and more and more, and it was super sensitive, and it couldn't, we let go of a lot of things that are just human, like intuition and compassion and forgiveness. And a child like the children that I've looked at had, a lot of ups and downs. And what was registered was only the moment they had interface with police. It's really policing data. So I thought there was this kind of low resolution of the story where all the other values that we are dealing with, especially when we work with children or young people like that, were just totally gone from the algorithm. So I think it's a matter of language and understanding what a system like this can at all do, because, of course, love is not an indicator in there.
How beautiful would that be? I'm going to do something unexpected. I thought we had a little more time, but we don't. My bad. I'm so sorry. So, and there are still questions in the room. I know that. And we still have the room for a little more. So I would suggest that we take up the questions at the bar, have a little more debate at the bar. And I just want to thank first of all, our wonderful, wonderful, wonderful panelists for their fantastic input and their complimentary presence. I want to thank you all for sticking. Yeah, we can applaud in a second. I want to thank you all for joining us and for being with us in this somewhat complicated road. I want to thank the people at home. And I think now it's time. And Marjolein, obviously. And Kirsten. Katrien. Oh! This is what you get if you don't speak to everyone. I'm so sorry, Katrien. Thank you both for organizing a wonderful conference and for this evening. I would say this is definitely the moment for an applause.